The wine glass in my hand had barely touched my lips when my world came crashing down. I'm Amanda Collins, 34 years old, and that Sunday evening 3 weeks ago still haunts me like a nightmare that refuses to fade. The burgundy liquid swirled in the crystal glass, reflecting the warm light from the chandelier I had saved for months to buy. This two-bedroom house represented everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every late night I had spent climbing the corporate ladder at Henderson and Associates. The evening had started so differently. I remember standing in my kitchen that afternoon, carefully arranging the orders on my grandmother's silver platters, the ones that had somehow survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. The autumn sun streamed through my bay windows, illuminating the hardwood floors I had spent last summer refinishing by hand. Every scratch I had sanded away, every coat of polyurethane I had applied, represented hours of my life invested in making this place truly mine. My kitchen was my sanctuary, with its custom cabinets that I had designed myself and the granite countertops I had saved for 2 years to afford. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the pendant lights, and fresh flowers from my garden sat in a vase by the window. This wasn't just a house, it was a manifestation of everything I had dreamed of since I was a little girl sleeping in the cramped bedroom I shared with my brother Ryan. I had invited my family over to celebrate my recent promotion to senior marketing director at Henderson and Associates, the marketing firm where I had worked my way up from an entry-level assistant position over the past 8 years. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, stock options, and the kind of respect I had craved my entire professional life. Martin Henderson, the company's founder, had personally called me into his office to deliver the news. "Amanda," he had said, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile, "you've earned this. The Morrison account success was largely due to your innovative approach, and the client specifically requested that you lead their expansion campaign." The Morrison account had been a career-defining moment for me. The client, a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to rebrand and expand into new markets, had been skeptical about working with our firm initially. But my presentation, which I had worked on for 3 weeks straight, had won them over completely. The campaign I'd designed increased their market share by 30% in just 6 months, and they were now talking about a long-term partnership worth millions to our firm. The promotion also meant I would finally be able to pay off my mortgage early, something I had been dreaming about since I first signed those papers 4 years ago. The house had been a stretch financially when I bought it, requiring me to work 2 part-time jobs in addition to my full-time position just to make the down payment. I had waitressed at an upscale restaurant on weekends and done freelance graphic design work until 2 in the morning most nights for over a year. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the delicate porcelain with tiny blue roses that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. Grandma Rose had given the set to me specifically when I graduated from college, whispering in my ear that it should go to someone who would appreciate its history and beauty. Mom had been furious about that decision, making pointed comments for years about how family heirlooms should stay with the oldest generation until they were ready to be passed down. I had always been close to my grandmother, probably because she was the only adult in my family who had ever believed in my potential without attaching strings or conditions. She had worked as a seamstress her entire life, saving every penny she could to help fund my college education. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left me a small inheritance that I'd used to start my emergency fund, along with her jewelry and the china set that now graced my dining room. Dad sat at the head of my table like he owned the place, his weathered hands gripping his whiskey tumbler with the same possessiveness he had shown toward everything in my life since childhood. Richard Collins, 62 years old, had spent his career as a middle manager at an insurance company, never quite achieving the success he felt he deserved. His steel gray eyes surveyed my home with the calculating gaze of someone mentally appraising every piece of furniture, every decoration, every indication of financial stability. Richard had always been a man who believed that his role as father gave him permanent oversight rights over my life choices. When I was in college, he would call my professors to check on my attendance if I didn't call home every Sunday. When I got my first apartment, he showed up unannounced to inspect it and lecture me about neighborhood safety. When I started dating seriously, he would run background checks on my boyfriends using contacts from his insurance work. But it was the financial control that had been the most suffocating. Every major purchase I made, from my car to my furniture, required his approval and his mind. If I bought something he deemed unnecessary or too expensive, I would receive lengthy lectures about fiscal responsibility and the importance of saving for the future. He had co-signed my student loans, a fact he reminded me of regularly, and he seemed to believe that this gave him permanent input into my financial decisions. Mom, Margaret, perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to snatch shiny objects. At 58, she had perfected the art of passive-aggressive commentary, her thin lips always pursed in disapproval unless discussing something that could benefit her directly. She kept glancing around my living room, her eyes lingering on the new leather sofa I had bought to replace the hand-me-down furniture I had been using since college, a 55-inch flat-screen television mounted on the wall, the built-in bookcases I had hired a carpenter to install last spring. Margaret had never worked outside the home, dedicating her life to raising Ryan and me while managing the household finances with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that every dollar mattered. She had always resented the fact that I had pursued a career instead of settling down and having children, making frequent comments about how my biological clock was ticking and how selfish it was to put career advancement ahead of family legacy. Her relationship with money was complicated and often contradictory. She would clip coupons and shop sales religiously, driving across town to save 50 cents on groceries, but then spend hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets and scratch offs with the eternal optimism of someone convinced that financial salvation was just one lucky number away. She had always been envious of families who seemed to have more than we did, and she saw my success as validation that the Collins family could produce someone worthy of respect and admiration. My brother Ryan lounged in the corner armchair, his construction boots propped up on my coffee table despite my subtle attempts to redirect his feet. At 31, he still lived above our parents' garage in a converted apartment that was supposed to be temporary when he moved in 5 years ago. His contracting business existed mainly on paper and in conversation, more aspiration than reality. Most of his actual income came from odd jobs, under the table work, and what I suspected were less than legal side hustles that he was careful never to discuss in detail. Ryan had always been the golden child despite his lack of conventional success. Where I had to earn every bit of approval through grades and achievements, Ryan could charm his way out of trouble with a smile and a promise to do better next time. He had dropped out of community college after one semester, announcing that he was too smart for formal education and that he would learn better through hands-on experience in the real world. His contracting business was supposed to be his path to independence and financial success. He had convinced several family friends to invest small amounts of money in exchange for promises of future work and discounted rates on home improvement projects. Most of those projects had been started but never finished, with Ryan always having excuses about supply chain issues or scheduling conflicts that prevented completion. But Ryan possessed a natural charm and an ability to make people believe in his potential that had served him well throughout his life. He could walk into a room and within an hour have everyone convinced that he was just one good break away from major success. I had watched him operate this way since we were children, and I had to admit that there was something almost impressive about his ability to maintain optimism and confidence despite a track record of unfinished projects and broken promises. The conversation had been flowing smoothly enough for the first hour. I shared stories about my new responsibilities, the team of junior marketing associates I would be leading, the substantial salary increase that would finally allow me to start seriously saving for the future. I talked about my plans to renovate the master bathroom, maybe add a deck in the backyard for entertaining, possibly even start looking at vacation property in the mountains. Mom had made her usual comments about how nice it would be if I used some of my newfound financial stability to help family members who weren't as fortunate. Dad had offered his opinions about the stock market and suggested investment strategies that he had read about in financial magazines. Ryan had pitched a few ideas for home improvement projects that he could handle at family discount rates if I was interested in upgrading the property further. The undercurrent of their expectations had been there all evening, subtle but persistent. Comments about how families should stick together and help each other out. Observations about how large my house was for just one person. Questions about my long-term plans and whether I had considered the possibility that I might want to move somewhere smaller and more manageable as I got older. I had deflected these comments with the skill of someone who had been managing family dynamics for decades. I talked about how much I loved the neighborhood and the sense of community I had built with my neighbors. I mentioned the garden I had planted and how excited I was to see it mature over the coming years. I discussed my plans to host more gatherings and how perfect the house was for entertaining. But I could sense something different in the air that evening, a tension that hadn't been present during previous family dinners. Ryan kept checking his phone and exchanging glances with our parents in a way that suggested they had discussed something before arriving. Mom seemed more interested than usual in the specific details of my mortgage payments and property taxes. Dad asked more pointed questions about my salary increase and whether I had received any signing bonuses or equity stakes as part of the promotion. Then Dad set down his glass with deliberate force, the sound sharp enough to cut through my words mid-sentence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he stood up, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the table. His face had transformed from its usual stern expression to something colder, more calculating, like a mask had been removed to reveal the true person underneath. Amanda, his voice carried the weight of finality, like a judge delivering a verdict. It's time we had a serious conversation about this house. I felt my stomach clench with a premonitory dread, though I couldn't yet identify why. The cheerful atmosphere of the dinner party evaporated instantly, replaced by something that felt dangerous and predatory. What about it, Dad? You need to hand over the keys. This house belongs to the family now. The words hit me like a physical blow, as if someone had struck me in the chest with a sledgehammer. I actually felt the air leave my lungs, my hand trembling slightly as I set down my wine glass. The crystal made a small chiming sound against the table that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Excuse me? Mom nodded eagerly, her eyes gleaming with an avarice I had never seen so nakedly displayed before. It was like watching someone transform into a completely different person, the mask of maternal concern falling away to reveal something hungry and grasping underneath. Sweetheart, you're just one person in this big house. It makes more sense for the family to manage it collectively. We can all benefit from what you built here. The use of the word benefit made my skin crawl. This wasn't a family meeting or a discussion about shared resources. This was something that had been planned and orchestrated, probably for weeks or months. The way they were presenting their demand suggested that they had already decided among themselves that this was going to happen, and my agreement was considered a formality rather than a necessity. Ryan's smirk widened into a full grin that revealed teeth stained from years of coffee and cigarettes. Yeah, sis, I've been thinking about this place a lot lately. I could knock out that wall between the kitchen and living room, create a real open concept space. Mom loves that modern look, and this house has so much potential for renovation that's just being wasted right now. He actually pulled out a measuring tape from his jacket pocket, letting it snap with a sound that made me flinch. The casual way he produced it suggested that he had come prepared for this conversation, and he had been planning modifications to my home before even discussing ownership with me. The violation felt almost physical, like someone had walked into my bedroom and started going through my personal belongings. I've also been thinking about the backyard, Ryan continued, apparently oblivious to my growing horror. You could easily fit a workshop out there, maybe even a small guest house if we played the zoning right. I know a guy who could help us get the permits without too much hassle, if you know what I mean. The implications of his words weren't lost on me. Ryan was talking about my property like it was already his, making plans that would fundamentally change the character of the home I had carefully crafted. The guest house comment suggested they were thinking about this as a long-term family compound rather than a temporary arrangement. I stared at the three of them, my family, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and saw strangers. Worse than strangers, actually. I saw vultures circling a fresh kill, predators who had been watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The careful way they had coordinated their approach, the obvious premeditation, made me realize that this wasn't a spontaneous idea born from family financial difficulties. This is my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying all the conviction I could muster. I've worked 3 jobs to afford the down payment. I've made every mortgage payment for the past 4 years without missing a single one. I put my blood, sweat, and tears into every inch of this place, from refinishing the floors to painting every room. Dad's face hardened further, his jaw clenching in the way it always did when someone challenged his authority. And who do you think made all of that possible? Who paid for your college education when you couldn't afford it yourself? Who supported you when you were struggling to find your footing in the real world? Who gave you the foundation and the values that allowed you to achieve what you have today? The familiar guilt trip washed over me like a toxic tide that I had been swimming in my entire life. How many times had I heard this argument? How many times had they reminded me that their investment in my education somehow gave them permanent claim to my achievements? But this time, something was different. This time, they weren't just asking for money or favors or help with bills. They were demanding my home, my sanctuary, my most precious possession. Every opportunity you've had came from us, Mom added, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she wanted to make me feel guilty for having boundaries. We sacrificed so much to give you the best possible start in life. We went without things we wanted so that you could have what you needed. And now that you're successful, you want to forget about the family that made it all possible. The manipulation was so blatant and well rehearsed that I almost admired its efficiency. They had turned my success into evidence of their contribution, my independence into proof of my ingratitude, and my resistance into confirmation of my selfishness. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that they had been perfecting for decades. Ryan leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from casual entitlement to something more aggressive. Look, Amanda, we're not trying to kick you out or anything crazy like that. You can still live here. We just think it makes sense for the family to have a say in how the property is managed. You're not even using half the space anyway. The casual way he dismissed my autonomy was breathtaking. In his mind, my ownership was apparently just a technicality that could be negotiated away in the interest of family harmony. The fact that I might have emotional attachment to my home, or that I might have plans for the unused space, or that I might simply want to maintain control over my own property, was irrelevant to their calculations. Besides, Ryan continued, you're always talking about wanting to help the family. Here's your chance to do something really meaningful. Mom and Dad are getting older, and they deserve to live somewhere nice after all the years they've spent taking care of us. And I could really use a stable place to run my business from while I get things off the ground. The way he framed their demand as an opportunity for me to be generous was particularly galling. This wasn't charity or family assistance. This was theft disguised as altruism. They were asking me to give up my most valuable asset and pretend that it was a gift I was choosing to give rather than something being taken from me under duress. Get out, I said, standing up so quickly that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech that seemed to echo through the house. All of you, get out of my house right now. The words came out with more force than I had intended, but they carried the weight of decades of suppressed frustration and anger. I was done being the good daughter who sacrificed her own needs for the sake of family peace. I was done pretending that their demands were reasonable or that their guilt trips were effective. Mom gasped dramatically, pressing her hand to her chest like I had physically assaulted her. The performance was so theatrical that it would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Amanda, how dare you speak to your parents that way? After everything we've done for you, we raised you better than this. The irony of her claiming they had raised me better while simultaneously demanding that I hand over my house wasn't lost on me. If they had actually raised me with the values they claimed to espouse, I would have learned to respect other people's property and autonomy. Instead, they had taught me that family loyalty meant unlimited self-sacrifice and that love was conditional on compliance. Dad stepped toward me, his hand raised as if to strike me, his face flushed with the kind of rage I remembered from my childhood when he felt his authority was being challenged. But I backed away quickly, my own anger rising to match his. Don't you dare lay a hand on me. This is my house, and I'm telling you to leave immediately. The threat of physical violence was a line that I had never expected him to cross in my adult life, but it revealed the depth of his desperation and entitlement. In his mind, my refusal to comply with his demands was so outrageous that it justified any response, including physical intimidation. The realization that my own father was prepared to assault me to get what he wanted was almost as shocking as the original demand for my house. Ryan stood up as well, his bulk more intimidating than Dad's despite being younger. Come on, Amanda, don't be dramatic. We're family. We can work this out like adults if you just calm down and think rationally about what we're proposing. The condescending tone, the implication that my anger was irrational, and the suggestion that their proposal was reasonable if I would just consider it properly, made my blood pressure spike even higher. This wasn't a family discussion or a negotiation. This was an ambush that they had carefully planned and executed, and my emotional response was entirely appropriate to the situation. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie, my best friend and the one person in my life who had always seen through my family's manipulation tactics. She was supposed to pick me up later for our weekly coffee date, but her message said she was running early and would stop by to say hello if that was okay. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Stephanie Martinez walked through my front door like an avenging angel sent by whatever forces in the universe look out for people who are being victimized by their own families. At 35, she commanded respect wherever she went, her career as a detective with the local police department having taught her to read people and situations with razor-sharp accuracy. She had been my best friend since college, one of the few people who had known me both before and after I became successful, and she understood better than anyone how my family dynamics worked. She took one look at the tent scene in my dining room, the way my family was clustered together like a pack of wolves surrounding their prey, the defensive way I was standing with my back to the wall, and her entire demeanor shifted into professional mode. Her hand moved unconsciously toward her hip where her service weapon would normally be holstered, and her dark eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to assess threats. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Collins," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult people in high-stress situations. "Ryan, is everything all right here?" I could hear raised voices from the driveway, and Amanda's neighbors were starting to look concerned. The mention of neighbors was strategic and effective. My family had been careful to maintain their public image throughout their lives, and the thought that their behavior might become neighborhood gossip was enough to make them suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. The sight of Stephanie in her off-duty clothes but unmistakable cop posture made my family suddenly remember that they had urgent business elsewhere. Dad mumbled something about finishing the conversation later when everyone had had time to cool down and think things through rationally. Mom gathered her purse with wounded dignity, making sure to sigh heavily several times to emphasize how hurt and disappointed she was by my unreasonable behavior. Ryan packed up his measuring tape with obvious reluctance, shooting looks at my kitchen and living room like he was memorizing details for future reference. "This isn't over, Amanda," he said quietly as he passed by me on his way to the door. "Family is family, and you can't just turn your back on that because you've gotten a little successful." "This isn't over, Amanda," Dad echoed as they filed toward the door, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a threat rather than a promise to continue discussions. "You'll regret treating your family this way. Blood is thicker than water, and you're going to need us eventually. When that day comes, you better hope we're feeling forgiving." The veiled threats made my skin crawl, but they also clarified something important for me. This wasn't about family love or mutual support. This was about power and control, and they were willing to use intimidation to get what they wanted when manipulation and guilt didn't work. After they left, I collapsed onto my sofa, my hands shaking as the full magnitude of what had just happened hit me like a delayed earthquake. Stephanie sat beside me, her dark eyes filled with concern and something else that I recognized as professional interest. She wasn't just looking at me as a friend who was upset. She was looking at me as a potential victim of the crime in progress. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but her expression serious. "My whole life," I admitted, the words coming out in a rush of relief at finally having someone to tell the truth to. "But never like this. They've always made demands and expected me to prioritize their needs over my own, but they've never asked for something this big before. This isn't just about money or helping with bills. They want to take my house." Stephanie's expression grew even more serious as I explained the details of what had happened. She asked pointed questions about their financial situation, their history of making demands on me, and the specific words they had used during the confrontation. Her training as a detective was evident in the way she gathered information, looking for patterns and red flags that might indicate criminal intent. "Amanda," she said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like the setup for elder financial abuse, except in reverse. They're using family pressure and emotional manipulation to try to gain control of your assets. That's a form of fraud, and depending on how they proceed, it could become criminal." The word criminal sent a chill down my spine. I had been thinking of this as a family dispute, painful and frustrating, but ultimately a private matter. The possibility that my parents and brother might actually be planning to commit crimes against me hadn't occurred to me, but Stephanie's professional perspective was helping me see the situation more clearly. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything that had happened, with Stephanie taking notes and asking me to be as specific as possible about dates, times, and exact conversations. She helped me start documenting every interaction with my family going back several months, looking for signs that this confrontation had been planned in advance. As we talked, patterns began to emerge that I hadn't noticed before. The increased interest in my finances over the past few months, the casual questions about my mortgage balance and monthly payments, the way Ryan had been driving by my house more frequently and always seemed to have suggestions for improvements or modifications. "They've been planning this for a while," Stephanie said grimly. "This wasn't a spontaneous idea that came up during dinner. They came here tonight with a specific agenda, and they had already decided how they wanted this conversation to go." The premeditation made everything feel worse somehow. It was one thing to have family members who were opportunistic or who made unreasonable requests in moments of desperation. It was something else entirely to discover that they had been systematically planning to take advantage of me for months, carefully studying my vulnerabilities and preparing their attack. Stephanie's phone rang early the next morning, waking us both from the restless sleep we had managed on my couch. Neither of us had been comfortable leaving me alone in the house overnight, and Stephanie had insisted on staying over to make sure my family didn't try to return when they thought I might be more vulnerable. She answered with her usual professional greeting. Then her expression grew increasingly serious as she listened to whoever was on the other end. I watched her face change from sleepy concern to alert alarm, and I knew that whatever news she was receiving was going to make my situation significantly worse. Amanda, she said after hanging up, her voice carefully controlled in the way that meant she was trying not to frighten me. That was Officer Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit. Your father called your bank yesterday morning, claiming to be concerned about your mental health. He told them you were having psychological issues and that the family needed to take over management of your assets for your own protection. The blood drained from my face so quickly that I felt dizzy and had to sit down. What? The bank didn't fall for it, thank God. They have strict protocols about this kind of thing, especially since they've seen an increase in financial elder abuse cases in recent years. But they wanted you to know about the attempt, and they are sending over all the documentation this morning. The violation I felt was almost physical. My father had tried to convince my bank that I was mentally incompetent, using lies and manipulation to gain access to my financial accounts. The casual ease with which he had attempted this fraud suggested that it wasn't his first time trying something like this, and I wondered how many other people he might have successfully scanned over the years. While we waited for the bank representative, Stephanie helped me start documenting everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. We wrote down every detail we could remember about the previous evening's confrontation, every threat that had been made, every indication that this had been planned in advance rather than being a spontaneous family discussion. The bank documents arrived by courier within 2 hours, along with audio recordings of my father's phone calls. The bank's security department had flagged his calls as suspicious and had recorded them as evidence of potential fraud. Hearing his voice on those recordings, calm and calculating as he lied about my mental state to financial professionals, felt like another betrayal that cut even deeper than the original demand for my house. Mr. Collins, my father's voice on the recording was smooth and concerned, like a worried parent genuinely trying to help a troubled child. I'm calling about my daughter Amanda's accounts. We've been very concerned about her lately. She's been making some erratic decisions, spending money inappropriately, and we think she might be having some kind of breakdown. The lies were so detailed and convincing that I almost wondered if he had confused me with someone else. According to his version of events, I had been acting strangely for months, making poor financial decisions, and pushing away family members who were trying to help me. He claimed that I had been talking about selling my house and moving across the country, abandoning my job and my responsibilities without any rational explanation. We just want to make sure she doesn't do something she'll regret, he continued on the recording. As her father, I feel responsible for protecting her from herself during this difficult time. We have documentation from her doctor about her mental state, and we're hoping the bank can help us manage her accounts until she gets the treatment she needs. The reference to documentation from a doctor was particularly disturbing because it was so specific and convincing. I wondered if he had actually forged medical records or if he was just confident that the bank wouldn't ask to see them. Either possibility suggested a level of sophistication and planning that made me realize how much danger I was actually in. The bank representative, a professional woman named Jessica Chen, arrived at my house with a folder full of documents and a grim expression that suggested she had seen this kind of situation before. She explained that financial fraud targeting family members was becoming increasingly common, especially in cases where adult children had achieved financial success that surpassed their parents' economic status. Your father was very persuasive, she said, reviewing the notes from his phone calls. He knew details about your account that suggested he had access to your personal information. He knew your approximate balance, your monthly mortgage payment, and the date of your last large deposit. That level of detail made his story more credible initially. The realization that my father had somehow gained access to my personal financial information was terrifying. I immediately started mentally reviewing every conversation we had had about money, every time I might have mentioned account balances or financial details, every opportunity he might have had to see my bank statements or other documents. We need to change all of your passwords and security questions, Stephanie said, studying the paperwork. And I think we should file a police report about the attempted fraud. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is criminal behavior. Jessica Chen agreed and helped us understand the legal implications of what my father had attempted. Impersonating someone to gain access to their financial accounts was a felony in our state, and the fact that he had done it using false claims about my mental health made it even more serious. She also warned us that this kind of fraud usually escalated if the initial attempt was unsuccessful. People who try this once typically try again, she said. They might approach other financial institutions, or they might try to access your credit report, or they might attempt to forge documents that would give them legal authority over your finances. You need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. That afternoon, we returned to my house to find the front door ajar. My heart pounded as we approached, Stephanie's hand moving instinctively toward where her service weapon would normally be holstered. The lock had been crudely forced, leaving scratches and gouges in the metal that looked like they had been made with a crowbar or similar tool. The violation felt almost physical, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. Inside, my home had been systematically searched, not destroyed or vandalized, but carefully and thoroughly gone through by someone who knew what they were looking for. Drawers had been pulled open and their contents examined. Cushions had been moved and replaced. Papers had been sorted through and restacked. Filing cabinets had been opened and documents removed. The precision of the search was almost more disturbing than random destruction would have been. This wasn't the work of casual burglars looking for easily stolen valuables. This was someone conducting a methodical investigation of my personal life, looking for specific information or documents that they could use against me. It took me several minutes to realize what was missing. My grandmother's jewelry box, a small wooden chest that had contained the few pieces of valuable jewelry I owned, was gone from my dresser. But more importantly, a folder containing copies of all my financial documents, including bank statements, investment account summaries, and insurance policies, had been taken from my home office. They took my financial records. I told Stephanie, my voice hollow with shock. Everything, bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, even my credit card statements from the past year. Stephanie's expression darkened as she realized the implications. They are not just trying to take your house anymore, Amanda. They are gathering information to support a more comprehensive attack on your finances. With those documents, they could potentially forge your signature on loan applications, open credit accounts in your name, or provide evidence to support claims that they had been managing your money. The systematic nature of the theft suggested a level of planning and organization that was genuinely frightening. This wasn't opportunistic crime or family members acting out of desperation. This was a coordinated campaign designed to gain control of my entire financial life, and they had apparently been preparing for it much longer than I had realized. We were still cataloging what had been stolen when Ryan's pickup truck rumbled into my driveway with the aggressive engine noise that he cultivated to make his vehicle sound more powerful than it actually was. He climbed out with the swagger of someone who believed he was entitled to be there, a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a tool belt around his waist. "Hey, sis," he called out, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was walking into a crime scene or simply confident that his family status gave him immunity from consequences. "Just came to pick up some of the old family stuff that Mom remembered was here. She said you wouldn't mind since it belongs to the family anyway." The casual way he announced his intention to take my belongings was breathtaking in its audacity. He was essentially confessing to burglary while acting like it was a routine family errand. The duffel bag and tool belt suggested that he had come prepared to remove larger items than what had already been stolen, and I wondered what else he had planned to take. Stephanie stepped between Ryan and my front door, her badge now visible on her belt and her entire demeanor shifted into official police mode. "Ryan Collins, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, burglary, and destruction of property." The color drained from Ryan's face as the reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He looked around wildly, as if expecting our parents to appear and rescue him from the consequences of his actions. "Wait, you can't arrest me. This is family business. I was just getting back what belongs to our parents anyway." "The only thing that belongs to your parents here is the right to remain silent," Stephanie said, pulling out her handcuffs with practiced efficiency, "which I strongly suggest you exercise immediately." Ryan's arrest was swift and professional, but the implications were staggering. As Stephanie read him his rights, I realized that my brother had probably committed multiple felonies in the span of less than 24 hours. Breaking into my house was bad enough, but stealing financial documents suggested identity theft and fraud charges that could result in serious prison time. The next few days passed in a blur of police statements, insurance claims, and legal consultations. Stephanie connected me with a lawyer who specialized in family disputes and financial abuse, a sharp woman named Elena Rodriguez who listened to my story with the grim familiarity of someone who had heard similar tales too many times before. Her office was located in a modern building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city where I had built my career and my life. Elena was in her mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair that she wore in an elegant chignon and piercing brown eyes that missed nothing. She had built her practice around cases involving financial exploitation of family members, and she had developed a reputation for being both compassionate with victims and ruthless with perpetrators. Her office walls were lined with law books and framed certificates, but also with thank you letters from clients whose lives she had helped rebuild. "What you're describing is textbook financial abuse," she said after I had finished recounting the events of the past week. "The escalation pattern is classic. It starts with emotional manipulation and guilt trips, progresses to specific demands for money or property, and then moves into fraud and theft when the victim doesn't comply willingly." She explained that family financial abuse was much more common than most people realized, but that it was often underreported because victims were reluctant to involve law enforcement against their own relatives. The cases that did make it to court often revealed years or even decades of systematic exploitation that had been hidden behind the facade of family loyalty and mutual support. The fact that they came to your house with specific demands and tools suggests this wasn't impulsive. Lena continued, making notes on a legal pad as she spoke. The bank fraud attempt the next day confirms premeditation, and the burglary shows they are willing to escalate to serious criminal behavior when other methods don't work. While Ryan sat in county lockup awaiting his bail hearing, my parents launched their counterattack with the precision of a military campaign. Social media posts appeared overnight across multiple platforms, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in their time of greatest need. They called relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, spinning elaborate tales of my supposed mental breakdown and their desperate attempts to help me before I destroy myself completely. The lies were remarkably creative and well coordinated. According to their version of events, I had been acting erratically for months, making poor financial decisions and pushing away everyone who tried to help me. They claimed that I had been talking about selling my house and disappearing, abandoning my job and my responsibilities without any rational explanation. They said they had tried to intervene out of love and concern, but that I had responded with hostility and threats. The most disturbing aspect of their campaign was how plausible they made it sound. They included just enough true details to make their lies convincing. They mentioned my recent promotion, but framed it as evidence that I was under too much stress to think clearly. They talked about my house, but suggested that I was obsessed with material possessions to an unhealthy degree. They even referenced my grandmother's death, implying that I had never properly grieved and that my current behavior was a delayed psychological response to loss. The social media posts were particularly sophisticated, designed to generate sympathy for my parents while making me look unstable and selfish. They shared old family photos with captions about how much they missed the loving daughter I used to be. They posted vague references to family struggles and asked for prayers during this difficult time when their daughter was going through something we don't understand. The campaign might have been more effective if not for the fact that several of my neighbors had witnessed Ryan's arrest and were asking questions about what had really happened. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street, had seen the police cars and had been keeping an eye on my house ever since. She had also noticed my parents and Ryan driving by frequently in the weeks before the confrontation, sometimes slowing down or parking across the street to observe my property. But the real turning point came when Aunt Carol decided to get involved. Carol Patterson was my mother's older sister, a woman who had been estranged from our family for over a decade following a financial dispute that had never been fully explained to me. I barely remembered her from childhood gatherings, just vague impressions of a tall woman with graying hair who always seemed to be having tense conversations with my parents in corners of family gatherings. Her phone call came on Thursday morning, just as I was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the public relations war my parents were waging against me. I almost didn't answer when I saw the unfamiliar area code, but something made me pick up the phone. "Amanda, honey," Her voice was warm with an accent that reminded me of my grandmother, carrying the same musical quality that I remembered from childhood but had almost forgotten. I think it's time we had a conversation about your parents and their history with other people's money. Carol's story unfolded over the next hour like a masterclass in systematic fraud and manipulation. 15 years ago, she and her late husband Harold had loaned my parents $20,000 to help them through what they claimed was a temporary financial crisis. Richard had lost his job due to corporate downsizing. Margaret had been diagnosed with a health condition that required expensive treatment, and they had painted a picture of a family facing temporary hardship through no fault of their own. The loan was supposed to be repaid within 2 years, with modest interest that would help Carol and Harold with their own retirement planning. My parents had signed promissory notes, provided documentation of their financial situation, and made solemn promises about the importance of family helping family during difficult times. They never paid back a cent, Carol said, showing me copies of the documents she had saved all these years. And when Harold got sick with cancer and we needed the money for his medical bills, your father told us the loan had been a gift. He said we were family, and family doesn't keep score of money that changes hands during emergencies. But Carol's story went much deeper than a simple unpaid loan. After Harold's death, she had started investigating my parents' financial history more thoroughly, partly out of grief-driven anger and partly out of curiosity about whether other family members had been similarly victimized. What she discovered was a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades. She had documentation of other relatives who had been talked into making temporary loans that were never repaid. Friends who had invested in Ryan's various business ventures and lost their money when the projects failed or simply disappeared. Neighbors who had been convinced to advance money for various emergencies that turned out to be gambling debts or failed get-rich-quick schemes. Your parents aren't just greedy, Amanda, Carol said gently, spreading out a folder full of documents that represented years of research into their financial behavior. They're career con artists. They've been doing this for years, but they've always been careful to target people outside the immediate family. Going after your house was a mistake because it was too big, too visible, and it showed their hand to someone who actually had the resources to fight back. The scope of their operation was staggering. Carol had identified at least 15 different victims over the past 20 years, with total losses approaching six figures. The methods varied, but the pattern was consistent. Identify a target with emotional vulnerability or financial resources, create a crisis that justified asking for help, and then use guilt and manipulation to prevent repayment demands. Some of the victims were elderly relatives who had been convinced to make loans they couldn't afford. Others were friends or neighbors who had been drawn into investment schemes that existed mainly on paper. A few were businesses that had hired Ryan for projects that were started but never completed, with materials and deposits disappearing along with Ryan himself. The really sick part, Carol continued, is how they always made it seem like the victim's fault when things went wrong. When people asked for their money back, your parents would act hurt and betrayed, like the request itself was evidence of selfishness or lack of family loyalty. Armed with Carol's evidence and Stephanie's connections in law enforcement, Elena Rodriguez began building a case that extended far beyond my family's attempt to take my house. The pattern of financial fraud was clear and extensive, with victims spanning multiple states and going back over 2 decades. Elena explained that my case was actually the key to unlocking a much larger investigation. Because I had resources and documentation, and because I was willing to press charges, law enforcement could use my case as the foundation for investigating the other victims who had been too intimidated or embarrassed to come forward on their own. Your parents made a critical error when they targeted you, Lena said during one of our strategy sessions. You have the financial means to fight back, the professional credibility to be believed, and the documentation to prove what they've been doing. Most of their previous victims were isolated and vulnerable, but you're connected and strong. Meanwhile, the lawyer my parents had hired was busy making their situation significantly worse. Instead of advising them to quietly settle and make restitution, he encouraged them to double down on their claims and launch an even more aggressive public relations campaign. More social media posts appeared, more relatives were contacted with increasingly elaborate lies, and more accusations were made about my supposed mental instability and drug use. This strategy might have worked against a different target, but Elena Rodriguez had seen these tactics before and knew how to counter them effectively. She began documenting every false statement my parents made, every lie they told about my mental health, every attempt they made to damage my reputation. Each false claim would become evidence of defamation and harassment when we reached court. Your parents' attorney is either incompetent or he's been completely lied to about the strength of their case, Lena said, reviewing their latest legal filing with obvious satisfaction. They're claiming they have documentation proving they paid for half your house purchase. That's going to be very easy to disprove with bank records. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late October, with the kind of crisp autumn weather that usually made me feel optimistic about life and new beginnings. I dressed carefully in my best professional suit, a navy blue ensemble that I had bought for important client presentations, wanting to look like the competent businesswoman I was rather than the unstable daughter my parents were claiming me to be. The courthouse was an imposing brick building that had been constructed in the 1960s, with high ceilings and formal architecture that was designed to inspire respect for the legal system. The courtroom where our case was scheduled was relatively small but formal, with dark wood paneling and American flags that reminded everyone present that this was a place where truth and justice were supposed to matter. My parents sat across the aisle with their lawyer, a heavy-set man in an ill-fitting suit who kept shuffling through papers like he was looking for something he had lost. Their expressions were a careful mixture of wounded dignity and parental concern, like grieving parents who couldn't understand how their beloved daughter had turned against them so completely. Ryan was absent, still in county lockup because his bail had been set too high for my parents to afford. His absence was probably beneficial for their case, since his arrest for burglary made their claims about being loving family members significantly less credible. When the judge called our case, I felt my stomach clench with nervous energy, but as Alina began presenting our evidence, my confidence steadily grew. She was methodical and professional, building our case piece by piece with the kind of systematic approach that left no room for doubt or contradiction. She started by playing the recorded phone calls of my father trying to fraudulently access my bank accounts. The courtroom was completely silent as his voice filled the space, calm and calculating as he lied about my mental state to financial professionals who were trained to protect their customers from exactly this kind of abuse. Next, she showed the photographs of my forced door and presented the police report documenting Ryan's burglary of my home. The physical evidence was undeniable, and the fact that he had been caught red-handed with stolen property made his guilt obvious even to casual observers. Then she presented the financial records proving that every payment on my house had come from my accounts alone, with no contributions from my parents that could justify any claim to ownership. The bank statements, mortgage documents, and payment histories created a paper trail that was impossible to dispute or misinterpret. But the real turning point came when Elena played the recording I had made of my final conversation with my parents. Following Elena's advice, I had called them several days after the confrontation to give them one last chance to explain their actions and potentially resolve the situation without involving the courts. The conversation had been brief but devastating to their case. I had asked simple, direct questions about their claim to my house, and their answers had revealed the weakness of their position and the real motivations behind their demands. Mom, my voice on the recording sounded tired and sad, like someone who had been pushed beyond her emotional limits. I need to understand why you think you have any claim to my house. I've looked through all my financial records, and I can't find any evidence that you and Dad contributed to the purchase. My mother's response was immediate and telling. Instead of providing evidence or documentation, she had launched into an emotional tirade that revealed her true mindset about my success and her entitlement to share in it. How can you say that? Her voice on the recording was shrill with indignation and barely controlled rage. We raised you. We fed you and clothed you and paid for your education. Everything you have is because of what we invested in you. That house should be ours to help us pay off our debts. The courtroom was dead silent as that last sentence hung in the air like a confession. Even my parents' lawyer looked stunned by the casual way my mother had admitted that their real motivation was to use my property to solve their own financial problems. But Elena wasn't finished building her case. She called Carol to the witness stand, where my aunt calmly and methodically described the pattern of financial abuse that had been going on for years. Carol had prepared meticulously for her testimony, bringing with her a banker's box full of documents that represented years of research into my parents' behavior. Her testimony was devastating in its systematic thoroughness. She described loan after loan that had never been repaid, investment opportunity after investment opportunity that had turned out to be scams, emergency after emergency that had been manufactured to justify requests for money from family members and friends. I started keeping records after my husband died, Carol explained to the court, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony. I wanted to understand if what happened to us was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. What I discovered was that Richard and Margaret Collins have been systematically defrauding people for over 20 years. She presented documentation of unpaid loans totaling more than $60,000 from various family members. She showed evidence of Ryan's failed business ventures that had taken deposits and materials from customers without delivering completed work. She even had records of gambling debts and pyramid scheme investments that explained where much of the stolen money had actually gone. The most heartbreaking part, Carol continued, is how they always made their victims feel guilty for asking to be repaid. They would act hurt and betrayed, like the request for repayment was evidence of selfishness or lack of family loyalty. They turned their fraud into a test of their victim's character. Then Elena called the other victims to testify. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had loaned my parents $5,000 for what she was told was a medical emergency but had actually funded a gambling trip to Atlantic City. Mr. Patel, who had invested his retirement savings in Ryan's contracting business and had watched the money disappear along with promises of future work and returns on investment. Sarah Martinez, a single mother who had been convinced to loan money for what she was told was my college tuition but had actually been used to pay off credit card debts from my parents' lifestyle expenses. Each victim told a similar story of trust betrayed and financial security destroyed by people they had considered friends or family. By the time Elena finished presenting our case, the courtroom felt like the scene of a financial massacre. The scope and systematic nature of my parents' fraud was overwhelming, and their attempt to take my house was revealed as just the latest and most ambitious scheme in a decades-long pattern of criminal behavior. My parents sat in stunned silence while their lawyer frantically whispered in their ears, probably explaining that they were facing criminal charges far beyond the simple civil dispute he had been prepared to handle. The evidence was so overwhelming and comprehensive that there was no reasonable defense strategy available to them. The judge's ruling was swift and uncompromising. Not only did he dismiss my parents' claims against my house completely, but he also issued a comprehensive restraining order preventing them from coming within 500 yards of my property, my workplace, or any of my known associates. He referred the case to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible criminal fraud charges that could result in significant prison time. But the legal victory was only the beginning of their comprehensive downfall. The court proceedings had been covered by the local newspaper, and the story of the Collins family's systematic fraud quickly spread through our community like wildfire. The social media posts that were supposed to damage my reputation backfired spectacularly as former victims came forward to share their own stories and support my decision to fight back. Within a week, my parents were facing lawsuits from half a dozen other victims who had been inspired by my case to seek their own justice. Ryan's bail was revoked when additional charges were filed related to his contracting scams and the burglary of my home. The house where I had grown up, the place where my parents had raised me with lectures about family loyalty and financial responsibility, was quietly put up for sale to pay legal fees and potential restitution to their many victims. The final blow to their operation came when Ryan, facing serious jail time and the possibility of federal charges if the investigation expanded, decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony revealed details of their operation that I never could have imagined, even after everything I had witnessed and experienced. According to Ryan's confession, they had been planning to force me out of my house for over a year, carefully studying my financial records and looking for ways to establish legal claims to my property. They had researched the laws governing family financial obligations, investigated my mortgage terms, and even consulted with unscrupulous legal advisors about the best strategies for gaining control of adult children's assets. The plan had multiple phases, starting with emotional manipulation and escalating to fraud and theft if necessary. If I had agreed to their initial demands, they would have gradually increased their control over my property until I was essentially a tenant in my own home. If I resisted, they were prepared to use forged documents and false medical claims to have me declared incompetent and gain legal guardianship over my finances. They had it all mapped out, Ryan admitted during his plea hearing, his voice hollow with the realization of how much trouble he was in. Dad had been studying Amanda's bank statements for months, figuring out her spending patterns and looking for any expenses he could claim were responsible. Mom had been researching legal strategies online, reading about conservatorships and adult guardianship laws. The systematic nature of their planning was genuinely terrifying. This wasn't a family dispute that had gotten out of hand or a desperate attempt to solve temporary financial problems. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to gain permanent control over my entire financial life, and they had been preparing for it much longer than I had ever suspected. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new house, a beautiful three-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood across town where I didn't have to worry about unexpected visits from family members or reminders of the trauma I had endured. The morning sun streamed through windows that were truly mine, and a house that I had bought with the proceeds from selling my old home and starting completely fresh. The decision to sell had been difficult but ultimately liberating. Too many memories were attached to that house, too many moments of violation and betrayal that I couldn't escape as long as I continued living there. The new house was larger and more elegant, with updated systems and modern amenities that reflected my current success rather than the struggles of my younger years. Stephanie helped me arrange flowers in a crystal vase on my new dining room table, preparing for a small housewarming party with the people who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. Carol was driving down from Sacramento. Elena was stopping by after work, and even Officer Martinez, who had handled the investigation, had promised to drop by with his wife. The guest list was small but meaningful, composed entirely of people who had proven their loyalty and trustworthiness during my family's attempt to destroy my life. These were the people who had believed my story when my own relatives were calling me unstable, who had offered practical help when I needed it most, and who had celebrated my victories without expecting anything in return. Any regrets? Stephanie asked, stepping back to admire our flower arrangement and the way the late afternoon sunlight made the petals glow like stained glass. I considered the question seriously, looking around at the beautiful home I had created for myself and thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. My parents were facing multiple criminal charges and financial ruin. Ryan had been sentenced to 2 years in prison and would be a registered felon for the rest of his life. The family I had grown up with no longer existed, at least not in any form I could recognize or want to be part of. No, I said, and meant it completely. I regret that it took me so long to see who they really were. I regret all the years I spent feeling guilty for not doing enough for them, for not being grateful enough for their supposed sacrifices. But I don't regret standing up for myself, and I don't regret fighting back when they tried to destroy me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Martin Henderson, my boss at the marketing firm where I had recently been promoted again, this time to partner level with equity stakes and profit sharing arrangements that would secure my financial future for years to come. The message was brief but exciting. The Morrison account expansion had been approved, along with 3 new major clients who had specifically requested to work with me. As I read the message, I thought about the professional recognition I had earned through my own hard work and talent, success that my family had tried to claim credit for and ultimately control. The promotion and new clients represented validation that my achievements were genuine and sustainable, built on merit rather than manipulation or luck. Carol arrived first, bringing with her a bottle of expensive champagne and a smile that reminded me so much of my grandmother it made my chest tighten with emotion. We had been spending time together regularly since the trial, building the kind of genuine family relationship I had always wanted but never known was possible with people who shared my DNA. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass as our small group gathered in my living room, the space warm and welcoming in a way that my old house had never quite achieved despite all my efforts to make it feel like home. To family, Lena added with a meaningful look around the room, the kind we choose for ourselves based on love and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. As we toasted and laughed and shared stories about the future instead of rehashing the painful details of the past, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and total freedom. Not just from my parents' manipulation and impossible demands, but from the person I had been when I was still trying to earn their approval and justify my own existence. The doorbell rang, and I had opened it to find a delivery driver with an enormous bouquet of flowers. The card was from my colleagues at Henderson and Associates, congratulating me on my partnership and thanking me for the innovative strategies I had developed for the Morrison campaign. The gesture was thoughtful and professional, representing the kind of respect and recognition I had always craved from my family but had finally learned to find elsewhere. As I arranged the flowers in another vase, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She was confident and successful, certainly, but more importantly, she was free, free from the constant anxiety of trying to please people who could never be satisfied, free from the guilt of never being grateful enough for sacrifices that had actually been investments with strings attached. free from the obligation to accept abuse disguised as love. The legal battles were officially over, but the real victory was quieter and more personal. I had learned that love without respect is manipulation, that family obligation should flow both ways, and that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to yourself is the thing that looks like betrayal to others who are accustomed to exploiting your devotion. My parents had spent decades building their identity around taking from others and calling it family loyalty. Ryan had followed their example, believing that shared DNA gave him unlimited access to whatever I had worked to build. But blood relation is not a free pass to abuse, and genetic connection is not a contract for lifelong exploitation. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, I walked through my new house one more time, turning off lights and checking the security system that I had installed immediately after moving in. In every room, I saw evidence of the life I was building on my own terms, decorated with furniture I had chosen, art that spoke to my personal taste, and photographs of people who loved me without conditions or hidden agendas. The master bedroom was my favorite space, decorated in soft blues and greens that made me feel calm and rested after years of constant vigilance and stress. The bed was mine alone. The walk-in closet contained only my clothes, and the dresser held photographs of genuine friends and chosen family members who had earned their place in my life through consistent kindness and support. Before turning off the light, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out a small velvet box that contained my grandmother's engagement ring, the one piece of jewelry my parents hadn't managed to steal before their arrest. Carol had returned it to me after finding it among the items recovered from their house during the police search that followed Ryan's confession. The ring had belonged to my great great grandmother originally, passed down through four generations of women who had faced their own challenges and found their own strength in times when women had far fewer options and resources than I enjoyed. As I slipped it onto my finger, I felt connected to that legacy of resilience and independence, to women who had survived wars and depressions and personal betrayals with their dignity intact. My phone rang one final time before bed, a call from an unknown number that I almost didn't answer since I had learned to be cautious about unexpected contact from people I didn't recognize. But something made me pick up, and I was surprised to hear a familiar voice on the other end, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Amanda, it was my cousin Jennifer, calling from Oregon, where she had moved after college to escape what she now described as our family's toxic dynamics. I just wanted you to know that I've been following what happened with Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret. I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that, but I'm also incredibly proud of you for standing up to them. Jennifer went on to tell me about her own experiences with our family's manipulation tactics, stories I had never heard because my parents had worked hard to keep their various schemes separate and isolated from each other. She described loans that were never repaid, promises that were never kept, and emotional manipulation that had driven her to move across the country just to escape the constant pressure and guilt. You probably saved other people from getting hurt, she said, her voice thick with emotion that suggested she was thinking about her own painful experiences. And you definitely saved yourself. I know it wasn't easy to go through all of that, but you did the right thing for everyone involved. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about all the people who had been affected by my decision to fight back against my family's abuse. The victims who had finally gotten some measure of justice and financial restitution. The family members who had been emboldened to share their own stories and seek their own healing. The future targets who would now be warned about the Collins family's methods and protected from similar schemes. But more than anything, I thought about the woman I had become through this painful but ultimately liberating process. Stronger and wiser, certainly, but also infinitely more careful about who I allowed into my inner circle and what kinds of behavior I was willing to tolerate from people who claimed to love me. The naive daughter who had spent decades trying to earn approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving genuine love was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved from any relationship, familial or otherwise. As I finally turned off the light and settled into my bed, surrounded by the security and comfort I had created for myself, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a battle won and a life reclaimed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I would face them as myself, finally and completely myself, for the first time in my adult life. The wine glass from that terrible Sunday evening had long since been washed and put away, but the memory of that moment would stay with me forever, not as a source of pain or regret, but as a reminder of what I was capable of when pushed beyond my limits. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the worst betrayals, and sometimes the family that hurts you the most is the one that teaches you how strong you really are. In the darkness of my new bedroom, in my new house, in my new life, I smiled and closed my eyes, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The woman who had been afraid to disappoint her family was gone forever. In her place was someone who would never again mistake manipulation for love, or obligation for genuine family loyalty. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I had been freed. And that, I realized as sleep finally took me, was worth more than any house or inheritance or family approval. That was worth everything.